Good morning, everybody. This is an interesting session for us in that William and I did a session, the last Civil Service Live in the Queen Elizabeth Conference Centre, where we had we did actually sessions on 3 days, and we had a small room, and pretty full. This time it suddenly broadened out into having a great cavernous hall and a very good turnout. I'm quite interested that the session today was subtitled "Building a Better Democracy." Yesterday I did a session on another of my interests, which is constitutional reform, and there was a much smaller turnout. So it's interesting that digital engagement attracts the attention of civil servants. First of all, just a word about me and my background. I'm Alex Allen. My job currently has relatively little to do with what we're talking about today. I'm chairman of the Joint Intelligence Committee. But my background is as a long-time civil servant. I worked in the Treasury, in Number 10, in the Foreign Office, in the Cabinet Office when I was the first government envoy in the days back in 1999-2000 when the government had just woken up to this internet thingy and was a bit worried that people outside were not waking up to it fast enough and wanted to promote it. I mean, it was one of those happy days where I arrived in and it saw for it, it looked after itself. And then I spent some more time in Australia, but then I came back and was the permanent secretary of the Department of Constitutional Affairs, subsequently the Ministry of Justice. I've always had a strong personal interest in the issues we're discussing. I mean, being a sort of fairly nerdy early IT adopter and just getting very frustrated at the way in which the civil service is slow to adopt the new ways of working. It's still true. I mean, people think that we've made lots of strides and we've moved on to everybody communicates by email now, and isn't this grown up? But people don't really think through that we're actually basically using a derivative of the old paper-driven processes. We still make track changes on documents and email them to each other. We don't have proper systems for collaborating. We're still very bad at setting up decent ways of engagement with the public. But things are changing. The interest in this session, I think, demonstrates some of that. And what William and Tom and James will come on to talk about is some of the ways in which things are changing and their own experiences. One of the things that I think the government is beginning to get some of this agenda. This was the introduction, I don't know how legible it is, to the Public Services on Your Side, a document published earlier this year, when Paul Brown, in his introduction, said, "I believe government's been much too slow to make use of the enormous democratizing, terrible word, power of information. People take it for granted they will access other people's reviews and ratings before buying something on eBay. We don't have systematic access to other people's experiences when choosing a GP practice or a nursery." I think that's quite an important statement, and it's one of the things which we're working in government to try and open up, to try and look at ways in which people can find the information they want, and government can contribute in a way which actually means something to the people. There are a number of key themes coming out of the Working Together document. It's first of all that we need to have more open, we need to be more open about information, something James is going to talk about. People need to understand what's going on. We equally need to promote open innovation. so that we actually enable people, the enormous power and interest there is out there to develop new applications. As you see with the iPhone store, you open up the possibility for people to develop new applications, they leap at it. And we've been very bad at getting that sort of energy into government innovation. Equally, open discussion. We're still inclined to send out printed consultation documents and expect people to send in letters with their, or if we're very bold, emails with their comments on a particular proposal, rather than actually developing tools that can enable people to do things interactively, to have conversations, to actually engage much more directly on how proposals will impact them. Equally, the point that was made on the previous slide about open feedback, we do need systems whereby people can get information about what other people think of the services, so that they can be better informed about choices and better informed about feedback. As an example of what can happen when you open up information, I mean, this is 3 different views of more or less the same information. I mean, the bottom one is the information about schools provided on the DCFS website, which is fairly geared towards a rather sort of professional kind of group, has search function for schools, but produces the output in a relatively unfriendly format. The second one up in the middle is DirectGov, which is got a rather better way of using the same data and produces a Google Map type approach if you're searching for local schools. The top one is a private enterprise called schoolmap.org.uk, and this followed partly from DCSF opening up the database to enable private entrepreneurs to produce their own versions, and producing something that has just a lot more information and is a lot more focused on what actually people will want to see and want to do. Finally, for me, the Power of Information Task Force, which was set up, I mean, one of the driving forces being Tom Oxford, who was a minister in the Cabinet Office until recently when he stepped down. This followed on from a project called the Power of Information Review that Ed Mayo and Tom Steinberg had published in 2007. And it was chaired by Richard Allen, who was with Cisco, is now, I think, with Facebook. And Tom and William were both involved with that. And it spawned a number of initiatives, one of which was Show Us a Better Way, which was one of the impetuses behind the schoolmap.org.uk initiative. And it produced a number of recommendations, which included public servants should actually take part in online forums and participate, identify themselves as civil servants, but not believe that it was somehow wrong or improper to participate in forums that were discussing subjects of relevance to their own work in their department. It also, and this is something which is always an uphill struggle and not helped by the revelations about the new chief of MI6 and his wife's Facebook page, but saying that public servants will require adequate internet access to take part in social media as part of their jobs, and that's certainly something we're all trying to push. It's quite often difficult in departments, and I'd be interested to hear your experiences on what you've got in it, what you've actually got access to, and what's blocked. It had quite a bit about, a big focus was on information and ensuring that public information data sets are easy to find and use, and there's still a lot more work to do on that. And including freeing up geospatial data should be a priority, and while they haven't gone all the way we want, I was quite intrigued to see the stand downstairs of Ordnance Survey. It had been a little bit of bit noir on some of these issues, actually has its top strapline, value the power of information. So, I mean, at least they're getting the wording, even if still some of the actions need to go further. I think I will pause there and hand over to William, who is going to come up here and talk a little bit about his initiative.
Remember not to cough. Thank you, Alex, and I share your irony of the Ordnance Survey. I think it's wonderful. It's a well-known fact that the Ordnance Survey actually employed lobbyists at one point to investigate me when I was a civil servant, so no applause there. I'm going to talk in this very echoey way, and I don't know if the people doing the mics can reduce the echo or do something with it. Perhaps you can. So I'm going to talk in a rather echoey way to you, and you'll hear it twice, those at the back, you'll hear it coming backwards and forwards a few times, about modern ways of working, and how if we have a modern knowledge working at the heart of the civil service, at the heart of our bureaucracies, whether it's the central government or local government, we'll end up building effective bureaucracy. But looking at the audience, it's always hard to see kind of bright light. I think many of you will remember this. Remember this? Remember one of these? 1977, this was my first encounter with modern technology. I think of this sort of the good old Atari console. And some of you, of course, will know one of these. This is some of your children. In fact, some of you who used an Atari in the 70s may now have kids who have one of these, or you may secretly use it yourself when they've gone to bed, or you may have bought one yourself. Now, a bit of a contrast between the two, and that was drawn out by President Obama's team when they moved to the White House. On their day one in the White House, that was their first reaction to the press. When they got to their desk, they tried to use the systems, they tried to use the IT, they tried to log onto Facebook, they tried to get onto their external email accounts, and they said it's like going from an Xbox to an Atari. Now, I've been out to the Bush White House. I went out to the Bush White House. I spent time with the President's Communications Agency, the several hundred people who support him, and they had a reasonably good operation. I wouldn't say it was backward by civil service terms at all. It was quite standard, highly secure sets of networks. So that's the reaction of a modern political customer to public sector systems when they encounter them for the first time, having used their own stuff outside the system. And in general, what we're seeing, to my mind, is a change in the customer of public sector information systems. We're seeing a transition as both younger people come in who have been brought up using modern tools at university or in their private life, and we're seeing sort of middle management cadre who here, show of hands, has never bought anything online. I can't see a single, two or three people out of a room with maybe 60 or 70 people. So we're seeing you all. Yeah, you have to well, good for you, but many people can choose to manage the risk. And for me, the benefits greatly outweigh the potential risk of being fixed which has never happened to me, despite the fact I've bought thousands of things online over time. So the customer, which is you in the room, is starting to change. Most conspicuously, we've seen some of our ministers change in the UK. This isn't just an American thing, it's not just a barn or where perhaps you might expect it. It's also changing here. This was Tom Watson, who was Civil Service Minister, speaking at a speech chaired by James, He said the process we have is essentially antiquated. It's endearing, it's charming, it produces a high quality product, but essentially it's out of date. If we're to move to a modern system, we need to change the way we work, and the tools we use as we work. But is it just Tom Watson? Now, the great civil service reaction, of course, is the minister's gone, phew, thank God for that. Now we can get on with doing what we were doing before. And there may be some things that he was really clever, he set down in statute or in a white paper and followed through with. We can ignore it, we can safely go away. I don't think that's the case, though. As we've been charged to prepare for transition and to consider all the options that are available in that, this is what the opposition is saying right now. Now, any canny civil servant keeps an eye on what the opposition is saying at any time. But this isn't just a series of random quotes from Osborne and from Lafayette, who, by the way, made a fortune in the software industry before he became an MP. Very, very capable. They're both quite clear about the contrast between modern information, modern knowledge working basically in the private sector, and traditional ways of working in Whitehall. And I have to say, I watched Adam Friday say that at a talk last week, and like Sandra, there was a certain glee when he used those words. So, is that really fair? Is it fair to say that we use these antiquated working practices? Well, those of you who saw me in Alex talk last year will recognise this slide, and I make no apologies for repeating it. This is the Northcote Petroleum Report. This is the reason why we're all here today. This is the thing that curated the modern civil service. relatively free of corruption, treated on merit, extraordinary thing for its time in the mid-19th century. And this is how they published the book. So Alex, Tom and James as well and I all worked on a thing called Power of Information, which was about modernising information publishing. And despite my best efforts, when the report came out, it looked like that. So in reality, we're still doing much the same thing. And I would say that if you took North Coventry Rebellion out of the dry stores, they're probably in the Ashmolean or somewhere in the basement, and sort of put them at a desk and rehydrated them, they feel quite comfortable within a day or so. In the way in which we work, in the way in which we send information to each other. As Alex said, just sending Word documents to each other with markup is very, very similar to the practice when I joined Civil Service in 1994, where different grades of civil servants would be given different coloured pens to write with, so they could make margin comments. And if someone would correct me, I think assistant secretaries had red pens, deputy secretaries had green, undersecretaries had green pens, and deputy secretaries had purple pens. And that's how you knew whose comments to take seriously in the margin of your documents. So this practice of sending these big lumpy text documents to each other leads to very unfortunate side effects in the way we compartmentalise our knowledge. And we end up in a very, very complex tangled system where most of our knowledge is emailed around to each other and can only really be found again as long as there's someone still alive or in their job who was on the original copy list. Once knowledge has been created in an email and sent around, it's very, very hard to find it. And that's despite the best efforts of departmental knowledge management systems or having used many of them, it's because of them, because they are so bloody hard to use and extremely unfriendly. So, what I was very frustrated with this state of affairs, I created a thing, which is now out there on the web thanks to Alex. I wrote a short in classic civil service where I wrote a paper about it. That's what we do if you write about something in civil service. And I created a thing I called Blackboard, a shorthand for modern ways of working. What I'm going to do is show you one or two things that I think are very modern, very forward-looking, very futuristic in the way in which we work. And one or two speculative things that I think could happen in a sort of blackboard environment where we embrace modern knowledge working. So this is the first one. You remember I got that slide up very briefly of the Power of Information response, or whatever it was that we published. Well, we broke out with secure networks to write that. We were working with people who weren't on the GSI, they weren't on secure networks, they didn't want to be the best in the world, and travel around a lot. So we used a thing called FaceCam, which we were able to access from the Cabinet Office, from a confidential file system on the ex-GSI. We were able to access this through our web browsers. We were able to upload documents to it. We had the wiki in there that we could trade drafts in, and it cost us $24 a month. So I just stuck that on my credit card and sent it back. I couldn't be bothered to use any other knowledge management solution. It worked extremely well for us. We couldn't possibly have done the research and delivered that project without it. So we got off the network and we've done modern way of sharing our knowledge. This is good old Tom Watson again. I had this, one of those, you probably all had one of those horrible meetings with ministers where the atmosphere was very bad and the officials were disagreeing with each other. It wasn't a very pleasant meeting. And in the meeting we finally agreed on something that the minister wanted. I got back to the office, I said to my team something here today, I just had this awful meeting with Tom Watson, because someone gets a cup of tea, it's like, they said, yeah, we know, he's just logged it. We just read about it, and we think he probably pushed the publish button just as we left the room from the meeting to make absolutely certain that his record of the meeting was the one that was made public, so that we did what he wanted. Now he's doing that to Pat, he was a government minister at 41, and he's just a different type of customer. He just does things in a different way. This is Tom again on Twitter. Some of you may have heard of Twitter. It's a way of basically doing text messages online, short messages online so that everyone can see them. And we were all encouraged to use this. I sort of was experimenting with this thing, and you have to follow this conversation from the bottom up. I just sort of tweeted, as they say, that I was back at my desk and on my job. And then all of a sudden, Tom Watson comes in and says, well, let me know when you finish your money, and then you can talk to me about it. And for a civil servant, it's quite shocked to suddenly have your minister actually come directly into a conversation when you weren't expecting it. And this was probably, we think, to our astonishment, almost the world first in civil service minister interaction. And what we see from Twitter and what we see from other modern ways of working is that publishing your information gets you out of the email mess where you can't find it again. So this is Andrew Scott's blog from On Digital Engagements, where he's just writing publicly about what he's getting on with, and Twitter's as well. And you have several pages now inside the secure systems that allow you to publish your work to a relatively secure environment. And when it's published, it's searchable, it's findable. you can almost, as it were, Google it up in a way you never could in an email system. And this is taking that to an extreme. This is a screenshot from this morning from an organisation called Right Set. They're a benefits advice charity in East London. And they have an old-fashioned discussion forum attached to their website. Nothing special about it. You just get a username, you log in, and you ask questions. But what they're asking questions about is real-life clients. So these benefits advisors saying, I have a client in front of me who has a problem. It's very complex. There's something gone wrong with the system. And those of you who work on frontline will be familiar with that. Does anyone know how to solve it? Does anyone else have this problem? And they discuss live, but pseudonymised client cases here in public, and they ask for help from other people. And this discussion forum has about 30,000 posts. This particular case here, I'm not sure how legible it is about someone who's had a stroke, and then their process has just gone horribly wrong after that. And people get real-life help to help solve real problems that actually benefit people right on the front line, and who are in states of great distress from the service. But by breaking a lot of what you might call emotional or cultural taboos, by actually discussing these things publicly. But it's empowered frontline workers getting on and using modern knowledge tools to do their job better. This is a fantasy slide for Blackpool. I would love to be able to Google other departments' files. I would love to be able to find stuff in my own filing system inside the civil service after many years as the stuff increases. So, could we not in a Blackhall environment, if we embrace knowledge working, just do this sort of thing? What is there to stop us inside the system other than sort of mental or cultural barriers from essentially Googling each other's files? There's a slight paradox at the moment in that on many occasions, not all the time, but on many occasions, it is easier for me to find out what my American counterparts are doing by using Google and their FOI approach and their publication approach than it is to find out what my English counterparts are doing. But something's a bit broken, but that can change. This is a personal hobby horse of mine. I've worked in a lot of wonderful Grade 1 style listed buildings all over Whitehall. I've worked in Admiralty Arch, Downing Street, Treasury, Foreign Office, all sorts, and they're all hideous to work in. The best one in the world. These buildings are not fit for modern purpose. The working environment is horrendous. I spent one summer on the top floor of a newly refurbished treasury and the temperature hit 40 degrees. And it was a completely unusable working environment. So why can't we just break out of that working environment and just work where it suits us, or get our customers in to work with us, or go and work with them? Can we not create green zones in our buildings where we invite anybody in to work with us to form policy or to do our job? As part of that, why can't we just, for instance, blanket SW1 with Wi-Fi, so that we can actually log on with enough security, not perfect security, but enough security to do our job? And much of the time, I spoke with GCHQ about this. I spoke at a conference on Monday, CDSG, with GCHQ, and they said, yeah, we can do that. We can do secure, restricted Wi-Fi across the whole SW1, it's just that nobody's asked us. So part of the thing I'm doing here with Blackpool is just trying to tee up some of these questions. And if you take that far enough, if you look at Britain's other great knowledge industries, journalism and banking in particular, the banking is not such a great industry. And some might say that journalism is never. That's another matter. In effect, they've just been reduced to metonyms. And as rules themselves, I expect a nice compound Greek word will work really well for you. But a metonym, someone's going to tell me that's not Greek. Is it? No? Okay. But a metonym is basically just a word or an object that's used to describe a set of things and cultures. And in this case, Fleet Street is literally that. There's no newspaper there. If you go to near Harmsworth House, where the Patents Office is now, there's actually a memorial on the wall to the last printing press in the street on Fleet Street. They've moved to modern, fit-for-purpose office environments where they can work more efficiently and more effectively. Banks have done the same. They're not in the city anymore. They're out east. Some might push them a bit further east into the sea, but that's another matter. So the question I'm posing is, why is Michael stuck in these antiquated 19th century buildings? Why can we not move to modern, fit-for-purpose buildings in which we can work well? And that's a question not just for Michael, of course, but for any city hall or town hall across the country, none of which are comfortable places to work for modern places. And that's pretty much it. If you want to follow some of the Blackpool stuff, I'll put it up online at that tiny URL when you go to my blog, or you Google up William Perry Blackpool, and it comes right to the top there. And I look forward to taking questions about that as we go through the morning.
Thank you, Ian. I'm not a civil servant. That's not true. I spent 26 days working as a civil servant officially. This time last year I did 2 days a week in the Cabinet Office, working for William, a unique experience in my career, on the Power of Information Task Force. Well, my background is, if you cut me in half, it will say internet. Back from 95, I spent my whole career having the best fun possible developing new products on the internet. Blessed to live in such interesting times. I've straddled two cultures in my professional and out-of-work career. On one side, I have worked for many large public institutions. Currently I work for Channel 4, where I run a new digital media innovation section called 4IP. But previously I've worked for many years for the BBC. I even spent a stint in Ofcom, and as I say, I had 26 joyous days in the Cabinet Office. Outside of work, I have had a lot of fun in my spare time building the kinds of products I would like to see that will enable citizens and consumers to really gain the most benefit from the control that the internet gives them. And I'm just going to, so on one hand, so I've built sites such as They Work For You, Fax Your MP back in the day, and in 98 I built a site called upmystreet.com. All of them really about citizens and empowering citizens through use of information and transactions. So on one level, you could say I've got an interesting perspective having been inside public sector bureaucracies and trying to innovate from outside of them. You could also say I'm slightly conflicted. I think both would be true. But I'll just tell a brief story of my experiences inside bureaucracies and from outside, trying to innovate and try and throw a little bit of light on the challenges and opportunities. So a bit about Up My Street. Upmystreet.com started out as when I worked for a very small consultancy, didn't have any work, and so the boss said, "You two over there in the corner, go and build us an interesting website." And he gave us, to his credit, the boss of the company, he gave us £10,000 and a month over the summer. And both my colleague, then colleague, Michael Steph Magdalinsky, and I decided that even in those days there was an awful lot of information on government websites. And we were interested to know that house price data was available, we were interested to note that school league tables and school information was available, be it locked up in a Windows help file format, which a good Russian hacker duly released for us. And also crime data was available, ambulance service data was available. There was a lot of information available that was geographic, but it was spread all over the deepest, darkest recesses of .gov.uk. And what you as an individual wanted to know was, what does this mean for me and where I live? So very simply, we liberated all of that data, put it in a database, and wrapped it around a user's postcode. So you put your postcode in, you got your house price data at the time from the land registry, you got your school's information about the schools nearest to you, how they performed over the previous years. Likewise, you got crime information about police performance and ambulance service performance, etc. And we really did it to have a bit of fun. But we also did it safe in the knowledge that if we had asked permission of it was like 8 different government departments, if we'd asked permission to do this, we'd still be waiting now for permission to come back. But we also knew that we were building something that was going to be very good. And we were pretty confident that those various government departments were not going to want to have this thing turned off. And with great credit, when the phone call came through about a week after we launched from a lawyer at HMSO, in those days responsible for crime copyrights, she was very keen to find a way to make what we were doing legitimate. And I think that woman in HMSO in 1998 deserves great credit for how she responded to a challenge, in some ways, to an external piece of innovation that disrupted in many ways existing systems of permission around crime copyright for government information. And within a matter of a few months, we had a license, and within 18 months, government as a whole had shifted its position, and there was a click use license, so anybody who wanted to innovate crime copyright information was able to do so without talking to a myriad of lawyers. And I think before we beat ourselves up, and we're quite good at that in Britain, that was exemplary back in the late 90s, that shift in how to manage that copyright. Many more shifts are needed, in survey here, but don't beat yourself up too much. Second example to talk about, albeit not directly civil servant, was They Work For You and Hansard. Similar, They Work For You is Hansard done as I would like Hansard to be done, which is wrapped around me and the issues I care about. What's my MP been up to? How have they voted? What are they talking about in the House? How often are they turning up? How good are they at responding to constituents' concerns? What are their interests and expenses? Interestingly, if you'd have been really delving into They Work For You for the past few years, all the expensive information to expose much of the scandal is already in there. Just no journalist bothered to look. Again, if we'd have asked Hansard, if we'd asked the clerks in a House of Commons for permission, they'd still be debating with MPs whether third parties should be allowed to republish Hansard and get the, particularly get the protection, the privilege you get in the House of Commons legally against defamation. We didn't bother to ask permission, we just sought forgiveness. And I think attitudinally, when people do create products with government information, with government services, outside the control of government, if those products are in the public interest, you should try and move the extra mile to embrace them and find ways of working with them. Quite difficult attitude, because people like me, in my late 20s as I was all then, quite chippy and aggressive. And again, great credit to the House of Commons, that within a month we had a licence. And within a couple of years, the leader of the House has stood up and confirmed that sites such as They Work For You would benefit from parliamentary privilege around defamation, such that if said in the Commons, it wasn't just protected on the House of Commons website. So again, it can be done. Jumping over the hurdle for a moment, being inside a large institution. I worked for many years at the BBC, doing BBC News Online, the early days of iPlayer, and while I was there, I could see all over the place individual small companies producing products for BBC content that, strictly speaking, was breaking BBC terms and conditions. BBC liked to control very tightly how this information was used. These people were not trying to commercialise BBC content, which is a bit odd. They were trying to have some fun and trying to show the BBC what products they really wanted. So an example would be, someone had plotted BBC News headlines onto a map, someone had done a very nice version of the BBC schedule on a mobile phone, what before the BBC had its television and radio schedule. And these people were getting letters from BBC lawyers automatically when the BBC works. Fortunately, the BBC at the time decided to try and bring these people inside their tent. And they created this initiative called BBC Backstage, quite quietly, very targeted, but realistically is a few thousand people who like to innovate with BBC content in ways that is some disruption to the BBC. Created an online mailing list, which cost the BBC nothing. Many of these people joined, launched a competition, the best ideas that people have. Many of those ideas that those individuals then had in the conversations between the BBC and those disruptive innovators happened in a way where the BBC became a bunch of individuals rather than an entity. And in terms of the change of relationship, a very confrontational relationship between the BBC as entity and some of the most influential people on the planet, pretty much transformed it, I would argue. And it did that for a simple reason, I want to commend on you, which is that over a period of time, the people who were running BBC Backstage gradually lost their BBC voice and had confidence to speak in their own voice, as employees of the BBC, but as human beings. And this is something I see often across public sector organisations, this fear of speaking with your own individual person, human voice, particularly when you're doing so online. It's absolutely vital in terms of building trust and building relationships with individuals. So tone of voice is important. Cost. I did a year in Ofcom, a year I'll never get back. Sorry. One of the frustrations I had in Ofcom was Consultations. Ofcom produces squillions of consultation documents. It seems to be its purpose. And they were all produced in much the same way that William described. And I decided working on the public service broadcasting review, an 18-month-long process that just buys out time, frankly. Had 3 phases and 3 drafts and consultations all over the place. So we decided, let's try and publish one of these draft documents, which were open for consultation, in a way that it could comment on every single paragraph and every single sentence. Let's basically turn it into use existing blog tools that cost $15 a month to copy and paste it in such a way that anyone could go in and make comments next to every paragraph. The internal IT department quoted me £250,000 when I asked them for a quote. It actually cost, total cost in terms of money out the door, was just under £4,000. Fully costed in terms of my time, it was around £25,000. And it produced hundreds and hundreds of comments, many of them very pertinent and pointed, frankly, but crucially from people who would never comment, wouldn't even know a consultation was going on if the traditional publishing format had happened. Crucial thing to learn there is, that might have failed. If I'd have agreed to spend £250,000 on failure, I should rightly have been fined. I decided to risk £20,000 of my budget on something that, if it failed, fine. If it didn't fail, well then, no, it's not going to scale to cover the whole of the rest of Ofcom the way it was built. But at least we've learned something that there's a potential here, and it is right to invest another £50,000, which is what Ofcom then did, to genericise the little hacked up thing that I had produced. And as a way of working, start small, iterate wildly if you have a success, kill things quickly if you don't, and recognise when the moment to go big. The moment to go big is very rarely before you've launched anything. There is a moment where you have to sort of put the whole power of the civil service to make something scale and enterprise strength and industrial. Across the civil service, I see that happening far too early. And part of that is that civil service finds it very challenging to work with small suppliers who often don't have, how shall I say, it's the overheads of some of the larger suppliers. I would commend the Central Office of Information to you as being a bit of civil service that does know how to deal with small suppliers, or can be very helpful. But very helpful for me when I built the Show Us a Better Way website when I was in the Cabinet Office. They found me a supplier and they managed that procurement really quite effectively. Just to finish, I want to talk about the edge of government online. In my day job, I run an initiative called 4IP. One of the sites we support is called Patient Opinion. Patient Opinion, run by 2 former GPs from Sheffield. It is in effect TripAdvisor for the NHS, from hospital level, doctor's surgery, people who've been there and their relatives sharing their experiences, both positive and negative, run very responsibly by these 2 GPs, who unfortunately don't know how to market, don't know how to optimise and search, which is where we help people go. NHS Choices, which costs a mere £20 million a year as a website, cheap, produced exactly the same functionality after Patient Opinion. And I would ask you why. The government is quite right to desire that tools are available for citizens to hold it to account. I would argue it's not usually the right vehicle for that holding to account to occur. Government does not run. There's a reason why the BBC is independent from government, and so that it really can hold it to account. And so just because you can build functionality into websites that superficially should allow you to have yourselves held to account, don't think you're the right people to do it. I'll give you an example. On NHS Choices, they get a fair few customers of the NHS sharing their stories. They have to delete nearly a third of them. On Patient Opinion, their deletion rate is under 4%. That tells you something about which is the most effective place for that conversation to happen. One final thing to leave you with, which is an anecdote or a little saying that I've taken with me, which is when I first joined the BBC, the man who launched BBC News Online was my boss. And aside from locking the door so even John Burt couldn't come in, to the very early days of BBC News Online, he told me this story about a monkey, 4 monkeys in a cage. and in the cage is a pole with a banana on the top. But every single time any one of those monkeys tries to climb the pole, the keeper would come along and spray them with a power hose, all the monkeys. And so, of course, after a very short period of time, any monkey who started to try and climb the pole got bitten up by the other monkeys. None of them wanted to get hosed. Over a period of time, monkeys would get removed from the cage and a new monkey would come in. Of course, his first instinct would be to climb the pole. But before the keeper had even turned up, the other monkeys would beat him up and say, "You don't climb the pole." After a year or so, none of the original monkeys were in the cage. The keeper had gone. There was no reason not to climb the pole, but all those monkeys knew that you shouldn't climb the pole. They didn't know why, but they just didn't climb the pole. Now, I'd argue that the messages you're getting from politicians and from the opposition says that now is the time to start climbing that pole for the opportunity that the internet and digital communication gives you to empower citizens to have services and live a better day. Thank you very much.
The boom here. I was actually going to sit down and do this, but I feel like I might be treated less professionally than the other three who stood up. I don't have slides, and I'm also a recovering civil servant. I managed slightly longer than Tom's 28 days. I managed about a year in the Cabinet Office, also working for Williams. So if you think this panel has been stacked by one of its participants, I think you might be right. I worked on the first Power Information Review back in 2007, wrote chunks of it. I reread it this morning to try and remind myself what it said. I couldn't remember any of it that I'd actually done. I'm now a journalist, managing editor of Prospect magazine, and I think I was invited because every good panel should have a journalist on it, even if we are a declining industry. I wanted to talk about politics, actually. This is about building a better democracy. It seems to me that for those of us who've been involved in trying to make government more transparent and open, this is an interesting political moment. We're going to have an election next year. We're probably going to have a change of government, and that change of government is probably going to come from a party that has put an awful lot of political capital into open data, open information and government transparency, because they think it makes them look futuristic, in touch with the zeitgeist, and because they have a small number of people advising them in Cameron who really seem to believe in this stuff. We've also just had a political crisis, which is rooted in an attitude to transparency. I had a row with my editor about what the expenses scandal meant. My editor is an awkward guy sometimes and has very strong opinions, and he decided that the expenses scandal was proof positive that transparency was a disastrous idea. That if you opened up the previously secret details of what institutions have done, then the only possible outcome was going to be rapid ruin, and people would find things that they didn't like and happen in an unmanaged way. And we had a big row about this, and I think he was wrong about it, and I still do. But his point of view had some merit, which is that there are good and bad ways to go about opening up your information to the public. Along with Tom, I'm a trustee. I've worked with an organisation called MySociety.org. I'm a trustee in a charity called UK Citizens Online Democracy. And our organisation has built many of the, I guess, the most celebrated examples of open information in Britain, from the number 10 e-petitions site, which William pushed through. They Work For You, which Tom mentioned, and a whole host of others. And so we've had a long engagement with Parliament, which has been difficult. I think Tom put a good spin on it to say that they've been reasonable. It's been a very difficult process, and Parliament as an institution has been a case study in how people who are used to holding information inside find it extremely difficult to give it out. And the expenses scandal, I think, is just the latest example in a pattern, and one which in the end will be seen as a triumph for openness, because the only way in which you were going to get to a situation in which people understood how MPs' expenses worked, how the finances of Parliament worked, was to remove the element of corruption and then publish it and let everybody know exactly what is going on. In the long run, the result of the expenses scandal is going to be greater trust in Parliament and greater engagement. And I sort of won the argument with my editor, but I tried my best. The oddity is that what's come out of this expenses scandal is a lot of focus on forms of direct democracy to reform Parliament, many of which are promoted by the Conservatives, from open primaries to more local referendums, which many of you might have to put up with in the next term, stripping away powers from institutions, not opening up the information within them. And it struck me as an odyssey that fewer people have looked at why this has been a triumph for transparency. What it seems to me is Parliament presents a common pattern that's been true of the 3 or 4 years that I've looked at this in government, where information is provided grudgingly. That over the last 3 or 4 years we've had, from the Cabinet Office in particular, a number of 2-pound information reviews and any number of other processes which are trying to nudge government departments and executive agencies into publishing more information. But we still are in a situation in which this is mostly done grudgingly, and one of the people in my society came up with a great sort of analogy the other day, which I thought I would share. He was talking about football and how you convince people that only going halfway in publishing information and having it reused by organisations like my society wasn't really good enough. And he was talking about Opta statistics, which I've gathered on every football match in the Premiership. I don't know if anyone, you sometimes see them in the Times, and they gather data on almost everything you can imagine, from how many goalkeepers have scored a penalty kick to how many times Ronaldo managed to cross from the left. And they get that because they record every piece of data, put it into a database, and the system is relatively easy to use. The equivalent in government that this person from my society thought was to say that you could get the same results by taking a large bag of videotapes into a room and with having a television in the corner, emptying the videotapes on the floor, and each videotape would have a game on it. Every game of the season or every half of the season, and saying, very well, you have the information there. Now go and find out how many goalkeepers scored a penalty last year. And see how long it would take you if you couldn't use the information in a way that was easy for you to find out the statistics that something like Opta would use would make available to you. Too often, that's the situation that organisations like my society from the outside of government find themselves in. That there is a commitment to some form of openness of publishing information, but it's not the sort of thing that you can get your hands on, it's not the sort of thing that you can reuse, it's not the sort of thing that you can republish. And I was delighted to see, I hadn't heard of Alex's school maps example, and that was an example that used to, it was very difficult to find out where all of your local schools are on a map, because the data was supposedly provided openly, but actually not in the way that anyone could get their hands on. My favourite example when I was in government, and I apologise if there's anyone from DCSF here, because it may all now be fixed, was positive activities for young people, where in legislation government was mandated to publish information on the positive activities that provided to young people, whether it's football or sort of free local swimming classes, whatever it might be. These tended to be published in PDF documents on local council websites, completely unusable in any of the places that any young person might actually go to find out about information in the local area. And as far as I know, it was proved almost impossible to find some way of encouraging local government and central government to work together to put this information out there in a way that organisations like ours and the myriad of other organisations like the ones that Tom worked for could come along, reuse them, put them in a format that people would actually find accessible. And so I think over the last 3 or 4 years, we've only got halfway along this route. We have too many situations still in which, despite the progress that's been made, we're acting as if we're tipping a bunch of videos onto the floor of a room with a television in the corner, and too few when for the public or for institutions like my society or charities trying to make information more available to the public, you can get hold of information in a way that allows you to create the type of services that 21st century public services require. So ministers talk a lot about social innovation and how you can use third-party organisations, whether they're in the private sector or the public sector, sorry, the private sector or third sector, to partner with government, deliver better services, and come up with ideas. The trick often is that social innovators remain very small.
the best social workers if we're dealing with drug treatment problem is probably a small charity in Hackney. It's very, very difficult to take knowledge that resides in a small charity in Hackney and bring it up to scale. And the same has turned out to be true for a lot of the organisations that try and reuse public data. They've remained small, and they haven't been able to work with government in a way that I think many of us would have liked. And the challenge for the next 5 years, whether it's under a Conservative government or under a fourth-term Labour government or under some other permutation of those governments, is to get to a situation where you don't have bags of videos on the floor, and where the innovation that's locked inside third sector organisations and private organisations can grow to a much greater extent than it has already. I think the nice thing is, and it was mentioned with the comparison between patient opinion and NHS choices, is that there still remains a massive opportunity. If you go out and try and find out information on who your local doctor is, teachers in schools, social care facilities, almost none of these are accessible on the web, and almost all of that is because the data that's locked inside government databases is available for people to be used. This shouldn't be, it's a target-rich environment for people trying to open up the state to those outside to produce better services. And I suspect the next 5 years is going to get us from the halfway stage to the type of services we all want to see.
Okay, well, we've got some opportunities for questions. If people like to put their hand up, then I think a roving mic will appear. There's somebody back there, so it's hard to see. Is there a roving mic?
Yes.
Yes, here it comes.
Hi, Helen Nichol, DWP. I was lucky enough to actually work with patient opinion while I was actually working for NHS Connecting for Health, who look after NHS choices. And it was incredibly clear to me the issue that we had with people wanting to talk to the government against people, the public sector, against people wanting to talk to a body they considered trustworthy. A lot of the information that we've had has been about sharing information. Patient opinion is very much concerned with using the feedback to actually make service improvement. How do you feel, based on the fact that we acknowledge it could be difficult for government organisations to collect feedback, how do you feel we can engage with innovators to enable the feedback to inform service improvement?
I mean, it's getting easier and easier, and many bits of government do this already, to listen across the internet to what people are saying about your services. I know, for example, that the armed forces take a close interest in ARS, which is the Army Rumours Network, which is where squaddies and squaddies families go to bitch. It's not hard to find out where those conversations are happening and to listen. It's not hard anymore. Well, it's a lot easier now than it was even a year ago for civil servants to go in there and start conversations as civil servants, given the changes in the guidelines for how civil servants can engage online, where if they're asked simple rules are be responsible, have a conversation, declare who you are, then you can both listen and respond to where people are being unfair and incorrect. But I think the principle that the healthiest place for that conversation to happen is probably not on government's own websites is a really important. And for example, the last thing I did, I think it's also true for the BBC, by the way, the last thing I did at the BBC was review everything the BBC had online. And my single most fervent recommendation there was that conversations about BBC services are probably best had not on the BBC's own site. I think same advice.
Other questions?
Thanks. Peter Jones from the National Archives, previously in the Select Committee Office at the House of Lords. One of the most interesting things that tended to come up when we were trying to get civil servants to come and give evidence to Select Committees is we also had to reassure them that anything they said to the Select Committee could not be, in a sense, held against them for any disciplinary purposes with their line managers. And I just wonder whether some of that actually freeing up civil servants to talk much more candidly about when they do have to disagree with government policy to be a healthy thing for democracy.
I mean, I think this does raise some difficult issues. I mean, I think it's the guidelines that we published are making it explicit that it's perfectly okay for civil servants to go out and give factual information, give out what is government policy on things. I do think there are issues about civil servants going out and criticising government policies on Web 4 or anywhere else. I mean, we do all work, so not all of us, but those of us who are civil servants work for the government, and we do have certain obligations as a result of that under the Civil Service Code. So, I don't think there's any incompatibility between supporting government services, providing information, gathering feedback on government policies, without actually getting out there and criticising the government in a way that could well be held against you.
I think there's an interesting case a couple of days ago with a woman called Lisa Greenwood, who sent an email from her work email address to Hazel Blears. Hazel Blears is the parliamentary email address, and was pretty rude about her. And she got fired. Now, I don't know whether she got fired for that, or there were other consequences, and they got reported badly in the press as this one because she was rude to Hazel Blears. I think she was right to be fired. Purely and simply because she's stupid enough to use a work email address to send a rude message to the minister. Probably don't deserve to work in the front line of government services. That's different from having an opinion that would be anonymous posted on the internet. So I think this is quite a subtle and nuanced area. And I would not pass a judgment about whether it is appropriate or inappropriate for civil servants to where the line should be. But I think that it's not a black and white issue. I agree with that.
Well, when working with the ministers, I've always seen it as a professional relationship, like a lawyer-client or an accountant-doctor-patient relationship. It just doesn't work if you go around slagging them off publicly. It's not going to work in any common sense way. What we're touching on here, though, is the public sector's approach to communication that's grown up since the late 90s. What the incoming Labour government in 96, 97 showed brilliantly was that industrial control of the message was the way to communicate successfully. And that functioned really well when there were only a relatively limited number of news outlets to whom you had to control the message, and therefore we would then focus your message through professional press communicators to make sure nobody else spoke. That worked brilliantly. What we're seeing now, though, as that case illustrated, is that everyone who works in public services and the citizens are their own media outlet using these tools. And what I've not seen yet is any organisation here or in America or anywhere else of any sort really properly adjust to having all its staff speaking about what it does publicly. The big technology companies who lead on this, they do take care to ensure that their staff are not going out there and saying the product is rubbish, because that doesn't work very well. And I think it's part of the deal when you employ somebody, you have certain loyalty to it. But there is a much bigger issue here about a fundamental shift in the way communication strategies have to work. Now I know Matt T understands this, appreciates it, but I'm not sure what the answer is.